Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pam Laricchia, longtime unschooling mom and author. Join me and my wonderful guests for interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free introductory ebook, What is Unschooling, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Laricchia, and this is episode number 75 of the podcast. It's the 7th of June, 2017, as I record this intro. In this episode, I'm excited to chat with Zakiyya Ismail. She's an unschooling mom of 3 kids, ages 10 to 19. Earlier this year, she hosted the first Learning Reimagined family conference in South Africa. She also shares her wonderful insights into the unschooling lifestyle on her website, growingminds.co.za. Our conversation spans from her journey to unschooling through the idea of deschooling parents as immigrants in our children's native unschooling world, to her thoughts around unschooling as a tool for decolonization. And there were lots of wonderful stops along the way. As a personal update, days are just skipping along here. The performance season is kicking into second gear, and Michael's only been getting 1 day off a week for the last few weeks, but he's still been coming home. Lissy and I are having a grand time planning her visit for later this month, and Joseph has been graciously brainstorming all things dystopian fiction with me most mornings this week, both world building and plot. He is definitely a font of information and ideas. So life just continues to swirl, and I do my best to remember to appreciate all the moments, seemingly big and small. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the show on Patreon. I wanted to shout out to those who have been supporting the show since the beginning, as well as send a big welcome to new patrons Edgar Masoni and Linda Lind. I deeply appreciate all of my patrons. You guys inspire me to keep going. I love that you're helping me share unschooling information with anyone who wants to explore ways to live this wonderful lifestyle with their family. And if you'd like to support the show, even for as little as $1 a month, check out the Exploring Unschooling page at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/exploring unschooling. And this week's quote is from Zakiyya. They view their learning as they do their breathing. That is, they do not view it at all. That's from an article she wrote titled An Immigrant Deschooler in a Native Unschooler's World, and we discussed it in more depth in our conversation. But I wanted to pull it out again because she's nailed something here that I found so true, yet so unexpected. It's us parents who bring that lens of learning and overlay it onto our children's lives. And that's because our lens has been grounded and polished through years of schooling. Even when we choose to leave the school system, it's a challenge to drop that schoolishness. And from there, it's hard to drop the search for learning. It can take a while for us to clear our vision enough to see that learning is truly innate, as instinctual for our children as breathing, and often just as indescribable. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear more from Zakiyya, so let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Pam Laricchia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Zakiyya Ismail. Hi Zakiyya.
Hi Pam.
Hello. I have run into Zakiyya quite a few times online in unschooling related circles and have always really enjoyed reading her observations and insights. She also recently hosted the first Learning Reimagined conference in South Africa. I'm super excited to chat with you. So to get us started, can you share with us a bit about you and your family and how you discovered unschooling?
Okay. So my family we 5 people, hubby and I, and my 3 kids. My eldest is 19, and then I've got a 17-year-old. Those are boys. And then I've got a 10-year-old daughter. How did we get to unschooling? Before we even had kids, we knew we're not going to do the school thing. We knew we're not going to do school even before we knew whether we were having kids or not. So that's how committed we were to not doing school.
Wow.
what we were going to do instead of school was something that we, were trying to work out. So we thought we'd open up an alternative kind of school, with what we thought would be useful. Thankfully, we didn't. It wouldn't have been a free democratic school in any way. So we explored quite a bit. And we realized that, okay, school's not going to, even alternative school wouldn't work because nobody was going to come to it at that point in time in South Africa. So when the kids came along, we just sort of went along on our way. We checked out preschools. We didn't like them. And, every year we were more and more confident about not doing the school thing. And the boys were 18 months apart. And, they played and they got along well and they were growing so beautifully and learning so much that I didn't really have a need to intervene. So technically we were unschooling. We just didn't know that there was a term like that until, and I think I felt quite isolated and my husband took to, he embraces the principles of unschooling very naturally. It's quite a bit how he grew up, directing himself and his education. So for him, it was easy. I felt isolated. So we used to go online and look for support. And in those days, it was Yahoo groups. Now it's Facebook. And I found homeschooling groups, which led me to unschooling. And I was like, oh, that's what we're doing. There's a name for it.
That is so cool. It's real. Yeah. To be able to come to that you guys came to the ideas even before you had children, just you knew school wasn't going to be a good fit for you guys and for your lifestyle. That is really interesting to me because, I was so just immersed in that culture and wasn't even a glimmer in my eye that there were other ways. So I think that's really, really interesting to hear. I love those kinds of stories. I also love hearing what unschooling kids are up to. I was wondering what your children are interested in at the moment and how they're pursuing it.
Okay. The timing of the school is good because if we did this interview a few months ago, I would say my eldest, who's now 19, I think recently and especially last year, he's struggling with a lot of internal pressure and some kind of angst about what is he going to do and how is he going to find a space that works for him. And the funny thing is, because he's a gamer, he plays a lot of online or one particular online game called Dota. And my advice to him was, maybe uninstall it, take a break from it so you can get some time to figure yourself out. Thankfully, he never listens to me and didn't. And then, about 6 weeks ago, he decided, I love talking all the time, socializing, meeting people, and I love gaming. And I'm going to find myself a space in this world, which is exactly what he's done. So now he is he's building a profile as a caster. So in traditional sports, we would call it a commentator. But in esports, it's a caster. So he casts and streams local games. He did a few competitions, tournaments. And he's got, a website where he interviews players. So he's doing some kind of journalism as well. And he's really happy because he's those two things about him that were the strongest. That's what he's doing. My 17-year-old, he is also a gamer, but he plays competitively. So he's in a professional team and they compete locally and they working their way up to become, an international team. And he's working his way to become the best possible player he could be in that space. My 10-year-old is also a gamer, but not competitively, very socially. So she has a huge network of online friends in all kinds of time zones. So she spends a lot of time being up for like 24 hours and then sleeping for like 16 hours. very erratic, but it depends on who's online and who she's connected with to do things. So she plays Overwatch and Minecraft, and then she also collaborates on some fan fiction. She loves writing, so does a lot of writing, role playing, anything that has a screen she likes, basically.
I really enjoyed hearing how they're meshing the things that they're finding interesting into the way that they engage with the world. That's really cool. I love how your daughter's she's finding her connections and she's just going with them. Like you said, she'll stay up for hours and hours, right? And then she'll sleep for hours and hours.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It's challenging for us, but I mean, she's my really truly free child, my fully unschooling child, because although for me especially, I embraced the principles of unschooling when it came to academics.
Yeah.
I couldn't let go of so many of my control issues in terms of sleeping and screen time, etc. with the boys. But when she came along, because she's only 10, so like 7 years later, I'd figured a lot of those things out. So she's really free. And it's interesting to see like how different she is in how she processes the world and her own self-concept and how much she protects her autonomy. So if I overstep the lines with my boys, they're so used to it from our patterns of behavior when they were kids. Then only, they don't see it immediately, or they make space for me. But she says, she just says, thanks, but I have my own thoughts, or I don't want to do that. And she's really firm, and she's immune to sort of what the societal norms are about sleeping and being awake and that. So she just really goes with her body and her rhythm.
I love that. And that's such a great point too, because we came to it a bit later when my kids, my older two anyway, were older. My youngest only had just a few months of junior kindergarten. And I love the way you said, your older ones are more used to it and they'll make some space for you. Yet your youngest is so free that she's really comfortable just being herself, right? And pointing that out, because I noticed that as well. That is so cool.
Okay, I think that is sort of one of the foundations is you need to start as early as possible, because then you really embrace your own autonomy and freedom. And it's an indication of just how hard. So they just had a couple of years of my control, and just how hard it is for them to also unshackle themselves from those control issues, which, that's why I think we need to be sympathetic with ourselves as adults, because we've had 30 years of it before we said, okay, let's get out of that. Yeah. So, yeah, it is interesting.
And I think that's why, I know for myself, my kids, my youngest will soon be 20 next month, or this month when this episode's out. And I'm still learning. I'm still discovering those pieces that are still buried deep in there, right? Even just for my own growth now, right? But I'm still finding those pieces, because there's just so much more of them for us, right? And I know my kids are still discovering pieces. Even I really like that idea of more free. I'm trying to think between, my youngest and my elder kids, because, they still get some conventional messages, but I think the less they've had on them, they've got that really strong free core that really helps them deflect those messages more quickly, I think, than those of us who've absorbed them for so much longer, right?
Yes, exactly. They need that deflector. Yeah. 100%.
That's very cool. You wrote a really amazing essay called An Immigrant Deschooler in a Native Unschooler's World. And in it, you nailed something that I had noticed but hadn't yet been able to articulate about how unschooling children do not look at their lives through the lens of learning. Like I've made comments here and there, but you really brought it all together. You wrote, they view their learning as they do their breathing. That is, they do not view it at all. So I was hoping you could share your perspective on unschooling natives, immigrants, and settlers. That's so cool.
Okay. So, just as we were talking earlier, that we come with all this programming, with this baggage, with our personal histories, which are informed by our families, our cultures, the movies we watched, etc. And, so that's a lens with which we see the world, and we can't escape it. We can try, we can work to improvement, but there's neural networks within our brains that are there, that will always be there, that we could always work towards building new networks, new neural networks, but that is the lens. And our lens comes from schooling. So how we did in school is what gave us social currency, what was our prognosis for how successful we'd be in the future, etc. And we also, associate school with learning when they actually have very little to do with each other. So when we drop the schoolishness, I like that word. I learned that from Akila Richards at the Unschooling Liberation event we held in Joburg recently. Mm-hmm. When we drop the schoolishness, we still hang on to that learning, like that's a value that we hold very, very high. And so I think so much of how we view the world and what we do, what the kids do, etc., is what the learning value is in so many things. And in their world, which for them, they don't have that lens. They're growing up freely and, embodying their what makes them feel alive and passionate about it. So in their worlds of freedom, we definitely are like immigrants. We carry our accent and our way of processing what's happening, some of it with fascination, some of it with indignation. But they're the natives of this world because they're born into it. It's natural for them to just live. Do not focus so much on living and not focus on who they're going to be in the future when they focus on who they are today. And then the settlers, I think, when, I look at so many families that are struggling with trying to get their kids to conform to some kind of idea of what parents think their kids should be. And I see so much of, extinguishing of the child's nature if they're not sporty enough to be more academic or the other way around, etc. And it just reminds me of, because I live in South Africa and we've got this very interesting history, 20 years into a democracy, that kind of thing, where there's also been a lot of cultural silencing of traditional African culture. I look at that and it reminds me of when settlers arrived to other lands and imposed, they didn't bother to learn what the lay of the land was, and just imposed their ways on the people and the land. And it reminds me, that kind of parenting model, I think, reminds me of the broader political, social context that we find ourselves in. And I think that parenting model and that political model, I think, are related in many ways in terms of the power dynamic that comes from the two.
I think I was really fascinated when you talked about that, because you can really see the foundational power dynamic that runs underneath both of them, can't you? Parenting and politics. And it had me thinking too, when we're migrating, as parents coming to unschooling, right? And I know when in my writing and stuff, I kind of used learning as that transitional lens. First, we're all typically looking for teaching, for schooling, right? That's whole schoolish kind of mindset. And then to try and transition, because learning is part of that equation, we're just dropping the assumption that teaching means learning, right? And then,
Yeah.
okay, start looking for the learning everywhere.
Mm.
But then it's such a great point that that the next step is, you know what? Eventually, you don't need to look for the learning anymore. Once you start to see that it's ubiquitous, that it's everywhere, that it's in everything, it is still an important next step to stop looking or needing to see the learning. And it reminded me so much of some conversations where, if my kids were feeling down about something or whatever, and I would try to I'd point out the learning, because that is something that like you said, we value as an accomplishment, right? Rather than breathing, as you were saying. And when I would try to say, oh, but you learned X, Y, and Z, and look how much compared to other people interested and everything, and they would look at me like, oh, I grew a second head or something. It's like, that doesn't matter at all. It's not impressive. That's just what I do. That's just my days, and that need to even to compare to other people is completely gone. So I always found that fascinating. The few times I would find myself in that conversation with my kids, and their reaction was completely different from, someone with my lens, my perspective would be. So I really enjoyed how you brought that out in that article.
Thank you.
And that leads really nicely into the next question, because I really wanted to chat about the idea of a successful unschooler. I read a comment that you wrote on Facebook on the topic, and it reminded me of something that I've talked about before, that unschooling isn't about just being a different path to raising a conventionally successful adult. And you mentioned the inevitable question of access to higher education and employability that is so often asked by people who are first curious about unschooling. And that's understandable, right? Because that's our lens that we're coming to it with. And we have such a tight grip on that conventional definition of success. But if we hold on to that for too long, it can really get in the way of our unschooling journey, for lack of a better word, can't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the worst things to focus on, is how, or not clarify in your mind what successful unschooling looks like, or what a successful person looks like. And I think the measurements for what unschooling looks like, and, I also get that pressure. So from other, people wanting to see what the kids are doing, not out of interest, but as a way of measuring how the unschooling is working. And there's a difference. So we do tend to think about how we can unschool and then still meet certain measurement criteria, like get them into university, or they're getting into university, etc. And we also, somehow, there's so much social currency attached to university degrees, even though so much of research is coming out, or the evidence at least, showing that corporates don't like graduates so much anymore because they find them not being able to critically think and look to follow orders rather than take initiative. There's so much on that. And then people still feel like, yeah, but if you just get that degree, and I'm like, okay, is that social currency that we're talking about instead of employability? So there's those two things. One is everybody wants to be able to make their way in their world and, earn money, etc. But it shouldn't be the overriding thing. I think you're only really being successful if what you're doing is meaningful to you and it's authentic, and you're not being forced into it by social norms or even the economy. So I think for me, what successful unschooling looks like, and which, overlaps into what a successful person that has unschooled looks like, is one where we let this process help us find ourselves and find our spaces and do what's meaningful to us. And we're able to be independent in that space that we found, so that we're not needing, financial support eventually from parents or the state or anything. And I think that the meaningful, authentic part is, for me, the defining criteria rather than how much you're going to earn or what social currency you're going to get out of that.
Yeah, that's what it really boiled down for me as well, to finding, as you mentioned, yourself and what's meaningful to you is so much more important. It's, because sometimes when I share what my kids are up to, I do it with a little bit of trepidation because it can look sometimes like conventional success. And, people who are looking at it through a newer lens will see that conventional success and say, oh, look, path, ABC, unschooling, here we go. It looks conventionally successful. Yet, even the way that they're approaching it is very different, right? It's because that happens to be something that was very meaningful for them. And so they chose it. It was something they wanted to do. They didn't choose it because it looked good. They chose it because it had meaning for them. But that's not something you can really say. You know what I mean? When you just say, oh, my kids are doing, because you're introducing, what are your kids doing? They finished unschooling. And you say, well, this, and this. And they go, wow, that's great. I want, that kind of success, or at least for that possibility to be there, because they're still holding on to that as a goal. But it's so different from the inside, right? From them making those choices just because they're meaningful to them. And, knowing that they can choose to step out of it too. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. That's another big one, that they're there out of choice, and that they could leave out of choice is a very different thing from I have to do this. Absolutely.
Yeah, from feeling like, okay, I've made this career choice and now, I'm kind of stuck here. They don't feel that stuckness. I'm sure they will ponder the question, but they'll be pondering it from from what's meaningful to them, if it's still meaningful, what other areas they might like to explore, rather than the question that, oh, I've had this success, I can't give it up because I'm worried about how I look from the outside. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. Absolutely.
Earlier this year, you hosted the first Learning Reimagined conference in South Africa, and I would love to hear how it went, and was hoping maybe you could share something that you learned or a new insight that was sparked for you from the weekend.
Okay, so it was the first of its kind, so we were quite excited about getting everybody that we've only known online and, just gathering and exploring these ideas as a group and creating sort of showcasing kind of temporary learning community. And I must say it really was an amazing weekend. I think I'd been to 2 unschooling conferences in the US before. And I looked at those, and my partner Claire looked at had attended the Home Education Festival in the UK that they hold every year. And we both took what we liked, and then we created our own very African one. And it was, so we expected, we had a number in mind of what we think we would get, and we got more than double that amount of people wanting to attend.
Wow.
To the point of that we had to close registrations in that last week because it was full. So that was an insight that was new for me. I really didn't realize just how much of an interest there is in looking at alternatives. And then the second thing I thought was interesting is we had a list of kind of things that we would discuss in the open sessions if we need to. And what I found was that so many of the attendees had moved past those points. So they weren't talking so much in detail about, okay, how do we get the learning to read, or how do we, the kind of new questions new unschoolers ask. And they were all very new also, or a lot of them were. But the questions were really the larger macro issues which got me excited, like, okay, how does this impact what kind of society we then have if we have a world where not everybody has to go to school. What does that mean? How does it? What kind of implications are there for the economy if we're not all going the tried and tested path of school, university degrees, corporate? All like really rich discussions about reimagining the world and reimagining community, really. So that was really, that was awesome. I think our speakers also, we had Manish Jain from India, and India, the word unschooling is not as popular, but it's what, it's that's how it looks. But they quite, I think, moved on a lot more than we have, in the sense that they've really worked towards building learning communities. And that's something that interests me here, about building sort of a collaborative learning community. So not just a community, and you see the learning thing, I can't get away from that lens, eh? But not just, let's get together and go ice skating kind of thing, but how do we learn together, pool our resources and share our skills and grow this community and the people around us, so that we increase and maximize the options available for us to create the kind of space we want to live in, that's meaningful and authentic. So that was nice that we had this discussion, that we could have some of those discussions at the conference.
Yeah, I really even in your title, I think, with Reimagined, right? Learning Reimagined, maybe that was part of the reason. That sounds like you guys had some really, really rich discussions. And I do really like the idea of, if we're replacing school with something, those kinds of learning communities, it's kind of what you I always kind of imagine maybe something around libraries, just a place where people can go to connect, because certainly here in North America, it's just the way the community is built. That congregation area really is for kids is school and the school building, right? Yet they don't have, within the constraints of classroom, et cetera, they don't really have time to connect. They're discouraged from socially connecting with each other anyway. So I really love the discussions around the ideas of where we can encourage or facilitate those kinds of connections between people who are choosing not to go to school. So I think that's really fascinating, because I know when we first began unschooling, there really weren't. We would travel to the States for conferences to meet other people, because there were so few of us locally, geographically, and most of their connection, as you and I have found, certainly at the beginning, was online, right? So It's really great that you're facilitating, and you found such a great reception to the idea of getting together and just talking about those kinds of ideas. So that was awesome.
Yeah, one of although I'm a long-time unschooler, we didn't really make it so much of an unschooling conference. I think we put out a lot of the flow of the talks, etc., was just to highlight a lot of issues and let people ask their own questions, and then leave with their own questions, with their own answers, and to leave with the way that they're more comfortable in, feel more confident about creating a path that works for them as families. As opposed to just saying, well, unschooling works, let's just do it and we're going to show you how. We just kept the unschooling out of it. Mm-hmm. Many of the people that were considering it, who saw how, saw this whole interaction between adults, children, free play, took more to the unschooling then. So I think we showed more than rather than tell, and I think that was what was so powerful about it. Mm-hmm. Also, like you say, traveling, I think it's really important for people to get together, even though that online community is so great. There's something that you need to do regularly, just be in the space with other people who get what you do and how you parent and how you educate. And it's fundamental. It gives you a kind of energy that you can't get online.
Yeah, no, it's just refreshing and inspiring, isn't it? I mean, I know I would come away from those conferences just, well, refreshed and inspired, right?
Yes, energized.
Yeah, energized. Yeah, exactly. It is just so nice to just to because you get to see the interactions versus like you were saying, you can read about those interactions from parents sharing online, etc. But when you see them in action, there it's a visceral experience that's very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and speaking of, since you were gathering people in South Africa, I was wondering if you could share with us a quick overview of what it is like to unschool there, and what are the legalities you guys are dealing with, and that you said you're actively building a community there. I think you have a space there now. You mentioned having Akila recently, so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that too.
Okay. So I think from when I started, when I was the only unschooler I knew, I think now we've really grown as a community of unschoolers. There's lots of unschoolers. And I mean, when I say lots, I'm still talking about like under 1%. I mean, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Right on the edge, about to fall off. But they are. So Johannesburg, where I'm located, there's a beautiful community. It's actually, to be honest, it's quite big in the sense that, there's almost like more than one unschooling community. So there's it's big enough to have its own little subgroup. So the people with younger kids get together separately often, or there's just some groups that just hang together that don't necessarily join the other groups. But it's big enough to have more than one group. And then there's Cape Town and Durban, I know, also has quite a few communities or families. So there's enough to have maybe park gatherings or, enough to have socials, let's put it that way, but not big enough to do something significant like build a learning co-op or something like that. I think we're not very far from that. And then what we also have Unschoolers Camp in November every year. And this year, I think, is year 7. And that's been growing from 5 families to, I think last year was about 20 families, which is from across the country. And it's kind of far out for everybody. So it's really only accessible to people who can afford to travel or have their camping gear, etc. And yet that's growing beautifully. So that's our highlight of the year, where as we get together as a huge, diverse community, to the point where other campers come and ask, so what are you people? Because there's all these mixed ages, mixed races, mixed race couples, and you all mixed and playing. And, there's just, who are you guys? It's quite funny. So that's our highlight. And then, so Akila was around recently, and so I asked her if she's open to, doing an event. And so we had a discussion on unschooling, liberation, and learning. And I mean, it was a Tuesday morning, and there were like about 20 people, which isn't huge, but I think it was big enough. Like there were at least 60 people that could have been there, but who had to be other places. So it's big enough to have these kinds of things. And it was great that other people then, this event was great, other than the content, which was awesome, but there were lots of new people who didn't know each other, and that lots of people hadn't met. So it was great that we just built this community physically, that we all got to meet each other. And the venue is called the Reimagined Learning Center. And I don't know if there's a relationship, but that's what their name is also, it's sort of a new sort of democratic I don't know democratic, but maybe self-directed free school. And it's sort of it's like, a really magical setting with like meandering pathways and tall trees. And so it felt like this is a space that this community could congregate to. So I'm really excited about that possibility. But I do put in a lot of effort into trying to build a community here, and really for very selfish reasons. Is I like the company. I don't want to be alone, and I like having to sit with a couple of parents, and we're not talking about how our children are not doing this or not performing, but we're celebrating who they are. I love having that opportunity to do it. So for me, that community is really about helping us. Building this community is about helping us find more people to hang with, really.
It's so nice to have those easygoing conversations, isn't it? Where people aren't complaining, but they're just celebrating their kids. It's a whole different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, it's just so nice. It's like, I don't know how kids feel about their parents talking about them, about how they're not performing. I feel really uncomfortable in those situations, and then I just usually stay quiet because I don't want to get into any mommy wars or anything. So the community I'm trying to build or trying to find for myself, I think is just so fundamental. It's what keeps me sane and happy, and also gives us a sense of comfort, not only me, but everybody else. When we all get together and we talk, I think we all leave feeling a lot more confident about that it's okay that we're doing this path that nobody else understands. It's okay, we good. So I think that's just that in itself is a good enough reason to build a community.
Yeah, no, and that was kind of part of the motivation when I started up a conference here in Canada too that ran for a few years, and that it really does help build that. It's like that sense of community. And we were talking earlier about how you feel refreshed and energized, and it's that energy that you can take with you for your other days, right? Where you don't have that immediate quick contact, but it's an energy or a lightness or that you can just bring with you and energizes your more regular days, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Definitely.
You wrote an article for the most recent edition of Families Learning Together magazine about your family's extended trip to India. And in it, you mentioned a moment that you were proud of during your visit to the Taj Mahal. And I was hoping you could share that story with us.
Sure. So that's why I'm still a deschooling immigrant, is we were at the Taj Mahal, and this is such a momentous occasion, and something on everybody's must-see list. And when we got there, my daughter looked at it for a few minutes, thought it's a really beautiful building, and then she was really totally bored with the history of it. I mean, she couldn't understand or had little interest in it. So out came her phone, and she was playing Pokemon Go. And I was not very comfortable with that. I mean, I just thought, this is the Taj Mahal. Like, why would you play Pokemon Go when you're at the Taj Mahal? And, my son also, he was like, Mom, really, we need to do something about her. And, so there was all this discomfort. So now, I was doing what she was doing. She was focusing on Pokemon Go, and I was focusing on her playing it. Neither of us were focused on the Taj Mahal. And I wanted to, so I went to sort of have a word with her, and she looked up from her phone, like really excited. I think she caught something very cool. And I looked at her face, and I realized she's having a blast. She's playing Pokemon at the Taj Mahal. I mean, how many people can do that? And I'm so glad I had that insight, and I saw her face, and I looked at her, and I was like, okay, that's awesome. I'll walk with you. And because what I was going to do is, have a word with her about how we experience these places through my lens of how we should learn about the world. And I'm so glad I didn't. And I let her. And I was really proud of myself that I could let it go, that I could then enjoy not only I enjoyed the Taj Mahal, but I also enjoyed how much fun she was having playing Pokemon Go there, which I wouldn't have done a few years ago. So I was quite proud to see my own growth there.
Yeah, I thought that was awesome, and that's why I wanted you to share it because, I mean, first, your point that because you were focused on her, you weren't enjoying the experience either, right? So neither one of you were, well, if you had talked to her. Anyway, that was a great point. But the growth that comes out of that is realizing that our lens, the way we define enjoying something, doesn't need to be their lens, right? They have their way that they enjoy things. And even for us to decide that this is something that they should enjoy, that should be important to them.
I know. That was,
right?
I was so disturbed that I still have those thoughts.
Oh, believe me, I know. And it was fun. Like a few months ago, I think I've mentioned this once before on the podcast. When I was speaking to my eldest, we were talking about, trips and traveling and things like that. And he could still remember and point out like the games that he was playing in those moments.
Oh.
And for him, he's like, "Oh, I remember when we went to Disney. I was playing this game and I was at this part and it was awesome. And then, when we were at the beach here, I was playing this particular game." He was taking in all those moments, but they were becoming so meaningful. Like he remembers that trip to Disney. He remembers that trip to the beach at Cancun. He remembers all. What he doesn't remember is us fighting about it, right?
Oh, you lucky there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a negative experience. And he remembers them. He remembers them through his lens, right? Mm. So that's what I thought. That's just such a beautiful point for us not to put our lenses and the way we want to experience things onto them. It's okay the way we want to experience, and we can dive into that. But also, it's just so exciting to be able to support them the way they're enjoying the experience too, So I thought that was a wonderful insight you had.
Yeah, the learning never stops.
I know, right? Life. You have also created a Facebook group called Unschooling as a Tool for Decolonization. And I was hoping you could explain what you mean by that and how unschooling can be that powerful option when we're exploring decolonizing education.
Okay, so decolonizing education is a really huge topic of discussion amongst everybody in South Africa. We've had so much of student protests, etc., around that issue. For me, I think we started this discussion earlier because I think for me, how we learn, that we focus on text and reading and writing, that to me is a very colonial thing as well. Or I just later discovered how colonial it is. I mean, I was also really concerned primarily about whether my son could read and whether they liked books and they liked reading. And that's one way of learning and one way of interacting with the world or a way of interacting with other people's imaginations. But it's just one way, and that's something that that comes from our colonial education, is that there's so many other ways of knowing, so many ways of being, and then there's so many stories. So we've prioritized, one small subset of knowledge, which really speaks to very capitalist kind of power. And in the meantime, other knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, the diversity that comes with the cultural knowledge of communities is dying because of our emphasis on schooling. And why I think unschooling itself is a potentially powerful tool for decolonization is that, because it also can't be, you can also not use it. I mean, there's lots of unschoolers that come onto the group worried that their children don't like reading and look for ways to help them to do that. So as an unschooler, we could also say, okay, all knowledge is fair game. Let's not prioritize only Western knowledge. let's not prioritize only knowing from reading. Whereas, if for you, if dance is the way you want to express yourself, then that's how you do it. And and storytelling is, it's a big part of African culture and Indian culture, I later discovered, or on my trip I discovered. So why don't we allow those kinds of activities to come into our world if our children like it, if we like it, nothing to be imposed on. But we're not privileging some ways of knowing, some bits of information over others. So when we talk about the freedom then to choose, the freedom to choose, the what's the word I'm looking for? What the options we can choose from is all options. So not just looking at one version of history, but looking at all the kinds of histories that could be there. Asking questions like, why is the history, when we talk about the history of, let's say, Germany and the Holocaust, why is there no mention of the social movements that actually opposed it? I mean, we've silenced what people's struggles were. In India as well, going to all the castles, we heard about the kings and what they did, etc. But there's no history of how did the people relate to it. And so we can say, well, to us as unschoolers, history is about all the social movements and how people related to events around them. And we're really not interested in, or we're not going to focus or prioritize what the leadership was doing. So we can reclaim how we want to understand the world, and we can take it away from colonial power and create. I mean, we can't go back to what there was because we've disconnected from it, but we can create something that's new and meaningful and something that's for a better world. And I think that's the important thing, is that in everything we do, it has to look like we're working towards a better world.
Yeah, I really, really love that perspective on it, and the idea that we can not just revisit, our assumptions about learning, etc., but our really deeply held assumptions and the more superficial things that we've learned, like deeply held assumptions about how human beings can be in community with each other, and as you say, the social movements and how we relate to one another, but on that deeper level than just kind of our day-to-day, because we are so caught up in that day-to-day engagement. But unschooling really does allow us to step back and look deeper at it, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's the blank slate. Say, okay, what is it? What do you want to do? What do you want to know? What kind of a world do you want to live? Yeah, we can explore all that.
It's a deeper blank slate. And I loved when you mentioned the lens of reading and writing as being, the one way to, or the best way, quote, to learn things and to communicate between people. Because, we talk about how, kids are going to learn that because it's so prevalent in our society. But I super appreciated, certainly with Michael, my youngest, because when he left school, he wasn't reading at all. And in junior kindergarten, they hadn't really started that a lot. And I got to see for the next 8 years or whatever, I don't know, was he 10, 11-ish when he was reading fluently? I mean, that's another thing. They define reading as it looks in the real world, right? As in, to them, reading is, picking up a Harry Potter book and reading it through. It's not, I'm reading because I'm doing early readers. There isn't that world. But to see his mind at work and how that not yet having that fluent reading skill did not get in his way at all. I got to see so many different ways of learning things and sharing things and communicating things. It wasn't a hindrance in his life at all. And that was a really interesting thing for me to see.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's it's actually amazing how much they can do without being able to read or read fluently. how they figure things out, use other patterns of knowing. I mean, I saw this with my daughter as well. She was about 5 when she said, I don't think I'm going to learn how to read. I don't want to. And I just said, there's 4 other readers here, so you're welcome to ask us if you need us. And, if my eldest had said that, I would have said, oh, this unschooling doesn't work. But with her, I knew that there's no way she can avoid the reading. It's going to come to her whether she wants or not. And it did. She doesn't like reading for fun. She said to me, I'd read, if I tried reading to her after the second paragraph, she'd say, Mom, I really prefer my own imagination. So what is I to say? No, this guy's imagination is better because the publisher, published it. So I left it, and it was really a good thing to leave, because now she just writes very deeply, very imaginatively. So a lot of her expression comes from writing rather than reading. And she says she'd wish she could do art, but she says, I've accepted I'm not good at it, so I'm going to move on. And no judgment. She's just accepted. This is who I am, defined it. And I was grateful that I had managed to let go of my beliefs and not worry about that she has to read and she has to enjoy it. And that's the only way to explore the world, etc. Yeah, so that's how I see how we decolonize ourselves, because we just chip away at all those little things, challenge all those little assumptions that we hold dear, and once we challenge all those things, that opens up the space for us to look at new ways of doing it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to look at it in the bigger picture too. There's just so much that we can release and that we continue to notice that we can release, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Zakiyya. It was so much fun.
Thanks. Yes, it was.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, and I appreciate you reaching out and wanting to chat to me as well.
Oh, that's awesome. And before we go, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Facebook, Zakiyya Ismail. My website is growingminds.co.za. And where else? I think those 2, hey? Yeah.
Great. I will put links to those in the show notes. And thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you, Pam. Okay, you too. Bye.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. While you're there, be sure to check out the first book in my Living Joyfully with Unschooling series, Free to Learn: 5 Ideas for a Joyful Unschooling Life. In it, I share the 5 paradigm-changing ideas that most help me better understand unschooling. Reviewers have said, a quick read, but packed with ideas that challenge the dominant paradigm of our failing approach to learning, this little gem makes an excellent argument for unschooling. And I was rather doubtful about this book, as I had never heard of the author, but after reading it, I wish that I had read it years ago. I hope you find it helpful too. Free to Learn has also been translated into French and Spanish. Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.